Robert Martinez had served his country for 22 years, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him now. His weathered hands shook slightly as he adjusted the small veteran's badge on his worn jacket lapel. The courtroom was packed with well-dressed lawyers and their wealthy clients, all waiting for their cases to be heard. Robert sat alone on the wooden bench, clutching a folder of documents that represented everything he had left in the world. The trouble had started 6 months ago when the luxury resort company decided they wanted his small piece of land near the lake. The property had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather who had built the modest cabin with his own hands after returning from World War II. Robert had planned to leave it to his son Marcus, who was currently serving overseas with the Special Forces, but now everything was falling apart. The resort's lawyers had offered him what they called a generous settlement of $50,000 for land that was worth at least 10 times that amount. When Robert refused, they found creative ways to make his life difficult. First came the surprise tax assessments that claimed his property was worth more than he could afford to pay. Then mysterious zoning violations appeared overnight. The final blow came when they somehow managed to get a court order claiming he was behind on mortgage payments for a loan he had never taken. "Mr. Martinez?" The bailiff's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're up next." Robert stood slowly, his old war injury making his left leg stiff. Around him he heard the whispers and barely concealed laughter from the other people in the courtroom. A man in an expensive suit nudged his companion and pointed at Robert's veteran badge, shaking his head with amusement. A woman in designer clothes rolled her eyes and muttered something about old soldiers living in the past. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Whitman, looked down at Robert with barely disguised impatience. She had been appointed to the bench just 2 years ago, and everyone knew she owed her position to the political connections of several wealthy families in the county, including the owners of the resort company. Her reputation for favoring corporate interests over individual citizens was well known among the local lawyers. "State your case, Mr. Martinez," Judge Whitman said, not bothering to hide her boredom. Robert cleared his throat and began to explain how his family had owned the land for decades, how the documents claiming he owed money were fraudulent, and how the resort company was using illegal tactics to force him out. But with every word he spoke, he could see the judge's eyes glazing over. She interrupted him repeatedly, asking for documentation he didn't have because his original papers had mysteriously disappeared from the county clerk's office. The resort company's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Bradley Morrison, presented his case with smooth confidence. He had multiple witnesses, perfectly organized documents, and a compelling story about how Robert had defaulted on his obligations. Morrison's firm represented half the wealthy families in the county, and he had never lost a case in Judge Whitman's courtroom. "Your Honor," Morrison said with practiced sincerity, "Mr. Martinez is clearly trying to avoid his legal responsibilities. The documentation is clear and unambiguous. My clients have been more than patient, but they cannot wait indefinitely for Mr. Martinez to honor his commitments." Robert tried to object, tried to explain that the signatures on the documents weren't his, that he had witnesses who could verify his story. But Judge Whitman cut him off with a wave of her hand. She had clearly made up her mind before the hearing even began. The other people in the courtroom were no longer even pretending to hide their amusement. The veteran's badge on Robert's jacket seemed to be a particular source of entertainment for them. One elderly woman in pearls leaned over to her friend and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "These old veterans think that little badge gives them special privileges. This isn't the 1940s anymore." A younger man in a 3-piece suit chuckled and added, "Probably picked that up at a pawn shop. Half these guys never even saw real combat." Robert's face burned with shame and anger, but he kept his composure. He had learned long ago that losing his temper would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on presenting his evidence, even though he could see it was falling on deaf ears. Judge Whitman barely glanced at the photographs Robert had taken showing the suspicious activities around his property, or the testimony from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment. She seemed more interested in checking her watch and moving things along. "Mr. Martinez," she finally said with obvious irritation, "I've heard enough. The evidence clearly shows that you have defaulted on your legal obligations. I'm ordering you to vacate the property within 30 days and pay the full amount owed to the resort company, plus court costs and attorney fees." The courtroom erupted in quiet satisfaction from Morrison's side. while Robert felt his world crashing down around him. 30 days to lose everything his family had built, everything he had hoped to leave for his son. The legal fees alone would bankrupt him, even if he sold everything else he owned. As Robert gathered his papers with trembling hands, the whispers and chuckles continued around him. His veteran's badge caught the light, and he saw several people pointing at it with obvious disdain. To them, he was just a broken-down old man clinging to past glory, someone who didn't understand how the modern world worked. Morrison approached him with false sympathy. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Mr. Martinez. If you had just taken our original offer, this could have been so much simpler. But don't worry, 30 days is plenty of time to find somewhere else to live. There are some nice retirement communities about an hour from here." Robert looked the lawyer in the eye and spoke quietly but firmly. "This isn't over." Morrison laughed, a sound that carried across the courtroom and drew more amused glances. "Oh, but it is, old man. It very much is. Unless you think that little badge of yours is going to magically solve your problems." As Robert walked toward the courtroom exit, the laughter and whispers followed him. His veteran's badge felt heavier with each step, a reminder of service that these people clearly thought meant nothing. But what none of them knew was that Robert had made a phone call the night before, reaching his son Marcus through military channels. What they didn't know was that Marcus Martinez wasn't just any soldier, and the people he worked with weren't ordinary military personnel. Outside the courthouse, Robert looked back at the building where he had just lost everything. But for the first time in months, he felt a small spark of hope. Help was coming, even if these arrogant people had no idea what was heading their way. The next morning, Robert Martinez sat at his kitchen table staring at the court order that would take away his home in 29 days. The coffee in his mug had grown cold hours ago, but he hadn't noticed. The small cabin felt different now, as if the walls themselves knew they were living on borrowed time. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the family photographs that covered nearly every surface. Pictures of his grandfather in his World War II uniform, his father during the Korean conflict, and Robert himself during his tours in Vietnam and later conflicts. His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably his son. "Dad, I got your message." Marcus's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in his 32 years. "I'm coming home. Son, you can't just leave your unit. I know how important your work is." Robert's voice cracked slightly. He had raised Marcus to believe in duty and honor, and he couldn't bear the thought of his son abandoning his responsibilities because of an old man's problems. "Dad, you don't understand. I've already talked to my commanding officer. What's happening to you isn't just about the land. My team has been tracking the resort company for months. They're connected to something much bigger than a simple real estate grab." Robert felt confused. "What do you mean?" "I can't say much over the phone, but this company has been buying up land all over the region using illegal tactics. They're connected to people who are washing money through real estate deals." "Dad, you accidentally stumbled into the middle of a federal investigation." Before Robert could process this information fully, Marcus continued, "I'll be there in 3 days with my team. Whatever you do, don't sign any papers, don't make any deals, and don't let them intimidate you. Can you hold out for 3 more days?" "I think so, but son, these people have power. The judge, the lawyers, even the sheriff seems to be in their pocket. Dad, trust me, the cavalry is coming." After hanging up, Robert felt a mixture of hope and worry. He was proud of Marcus for serving his country, but he had always worried about the dangerous work his son did. Marcus rarely talked about his assignments, but Robert knew enough to understand that his son's unit handled situations that regular military couldn't or wouldn't touch. Meanwhile, across town in the luxurious offices of Morrison, Blackwell and Associates, Bradley Morrison was celebrating his latest victory with his partners. The champagne flowed freely as they discussed how quickly they could flip Robert's property to the resort company for a massive profit. "Did you see that old fool with his little war badge?" Morrison laughed, mimicking Robert's slight limp. "These ancient veterans think the world owes them something just because they wore a uniform 50 years ago." His partner, James Blackwell, raised his glass. "To Judge Whitman for making this so easy. Best investment we ever made was helping her get that appointment." Morrison nodded. "Speaking of investments, have you heard from our friends at the resort? They're planning to break ground on the new casino complex as soon as we clear the Martinez property." The money flowing through that place is going to make us all very wealthy. What Morrison didn't know was that federal agents had been recording conversations in his office for weeks. The resort company he was so eager to help had connections to organized crime families who were using the development project to launder millions of dollars. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had been building a case for over a year, but they needed more evidence to make arrests that would stick. Robert's legal troubles had accidentally provided them with the perfect opportunity to gather that evidence. Back at the courthouse, Judge Whitman was reviewing her calendar for the coming week. She had several more cases involving the resort company's land acquisitions, and she was looking forward to the generous consulting fees she would receive for her cooperation. She had convinced herself that she was helping to bring economic development to the region, choosing to ignore the fact that her decisions were destroying families and communities. Her assistant knocked on her door. "Judge Whitman, there's a call for you from the resort company. They want to discuss the Martinez case." The voice on the phone was smooth and confident. "Judge, we're very pleased with how you handled the Martinez situation. We have several more properties we need to acquire quickly, and we're hoping you can help us move things along." "Of course," Judge Whitman replied. "I understand the importance of economic development. How many more cases are we talking about?" "At least a dozen over the next month. Each one represents significant investment in the community. We trust you understand how important it is to resolve these matters efficiently." Judge Whitman smiled. Each case would mean another substantial payment to her offshore account. She had grown accustomed to the luxury that her cooperation had provided, and she wasn't about to let a few stubborn property owners stand in the way of her financial security. That evening, Robert Martinez walked the property that had been in his family for 3 generations. The lake stretched out before him, peaceful and beautiful in the dying light. His grandfather had chosen this spot because it reminded him of the countryside in France where he had fought during the war. His father had added the small dock where Robert had taught Marcus to fish when he was just a boy. Now strangers wanted to tear it all down to build a casino and luxury hotel. They wanted to fill the quiet lake with speedboats and jet skis, to replace the forest with parking lots and neon signs. They saw dollar signs where Robert saw memories and heritage. As he stood on the dock watching the sunset, Robert noticed a black sedan parked on the road near his property. It had been there for hours and he could see the silhouettes of 2 men inside. The resort company had been sending people to intimidate him for weeks, but something about this felt different. These men weren't trying to hide their presence. They wanted him to know they were watching. Robert wasn't afraid. He had faced worse things than corporate bullies during his years of military service. But he was tired, and he felt the weight of fighting this battle alone. In 3 days, that would change. Marcus was coming home, and apparently he wasn't coming alone. The old veteran touched the badge on his jacket and thought about all the men and women who had worn similar badges, who had served their country with honor and courage. These people in their expensive suits thought that badge was just a piece of metal, a meaningless decoration worn by a broken-down old man. They had no idea what it really represented, or what it meant to the community of warriors who still answered when their brothers called for help. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to force him from his land. But tonight, Robert Martinez slept better than he had in months. Help was coming, and soon the people who had laughed at his veteran's badge would understand exactly what they were dealing with. 3 days passed like a slow countdown to something Robert couldn't quite imagine. During those days, the harassment escalated. Sheriff's deputies arrived twice claiming to investigate complaints about Robert's property. City inspectors appeared with clipboards and serious expressions, finding violations that hadn't existed the day before. The black sedan had been joined by a second car, both maintaining their vigil near Robert's land. On the 3rd evening, as Robert was preparing a simple dinner, he heard the distant sound of helicopters. The noise grew louder, and through his kitchen window he could see military aircraft approaching. But these weren't ordinary transport helicopters. They were sleek black machines that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The helicopters landed in the large clearing behind Robert's cabin, their rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and fallen leaves. As the engines wound down, Robert walked outside to greet his son. What he saw took his breath away. Marcus Martinez emerged from the lead helicopter, but he wasn't alone. 6 other men and women followed him, all wearing black tactical gear and moving with the fluid precision of elite soldiers. These weren't regular military personnel. Everything about them, from their equipment to their bearings, spoke of a level of training and capability that existed far beyond normal army units. Marcus approached his father and embraced him. Up close, Robert could see that his son had changed since their last meeting. There was a hardness in his eyes that came from seeing too much, doing too much, but underneath that hardness was the same caring young man Robert had raised. "Dad, I'd like you to meet my team." Marcus gestured toward the others. "We work for a special task force that handles situations where regular law enforcement isn't enough." The team leader, a woman named Captain Sarah Chen, stepped forward. Her handshake was firm, her eyes intelligent and alert. "Mr. Martinez, we've been investigating the people who are trying to take your land. What they're doing to you is just the tip of a very large iceberg." As they moved inside the cabin, Marcus explained what his team had discovered. The resort company was a front operation for a money laundering scheme that stretched across multiple states. They were using forced property acquisitions to create legitimate businesses that could hide millions of dollars in illegal funds. The casino and hotel complex they planned to build on Robert's land would be the centerpiece of the operation. "Judge Whitman has been taking bribes for over a year," Captain Chen explained, spreading photographs and documents across Robert's kitchen table. "She's received more than $2 million in payments through various offshore accounts. Bradley Morrison's law firm has been facilitating the transfers and helping to forge documents." Robert stared at the evidence in amazement. "How did you find all this?" Another team member, a man with the call sign Reaper, spoke up. "We've been tracking the money flow for months. The people behind this operation have connections to organized crime families in 3 different countries. Your case gave us the opening we needed to get close enough to gather evidence." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, tomorrow we're going to court. But this time, things are going to be very different." "What do you mean?" Captain Chen smiled. "Tomorrow, federal agents are going to arrest everyone involved in this conspiracy. But we need to coordinate the timing carefully. Judge Whitman has scheduled hearings for 3 other property owners who are being forced out through the same illegal methods. We want to catch everyone in the act." That night, while Robert slept more peacefully than he had in months, the special operations team prepared for the next day's mission. They weren't just planning to save Robert's property. They were about to bring down a criminal enterprise that had been destroying families and communities for years. In town, Bradley Morrison was also preparing for the next day, but his plans were very different. He had 3 more court cases scheduled, 3 more families to destroy in the name of progress and profit. He had invited several of his wealthy friends to watch the proceedings, knowing they would enjoy seeing more ordinary citizens crushed by the legal system. Judge Whitman spent the evening reviewing the cases, making sure she understood exactly what the resort company wanted her to do. The payments to her offshore accounts had made her rich, but they had also made her completely dependent on the criminal organization's continued success. She had passed the point of no return long ago. The resort company's executives held a celebration dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the county. They toasted their success and discussed plans for expanding their operation to other regions. They had perfected a system for stealing land and laundering money, and they saw no reason why it couldn't work anywhere in the country. None of them had any idea that federal agents had been recording their conversations, tracking their financial transactions, and building an ironclad case against them. They thought they were untouchable, protected by their wealth and political connections. As dawn broke over the county courthouse, sheriff's deputies and court officials arrived for what they expected to be another routine day of processing legal paperwork. The parking lot gradually filled with expensive cars belonging to lawyers, businessmen, and other members of the county's elite who had come to watch the continued destruction of the Martinez family. Robert arrived early, wearing his best suit and his veteran's badge. He looked nervous and alone, just as he had 3 days earlier. The same people who had laughed at him before were gathering again, anticipating another entertaining show. What none of them noticed were the additional vehicles parked strategically around the courthouse. Unmarked cars and vans had taken positions at every exit. Federal agents in civilian clothes had been entering the building since before sunrise, taking seats in the courtroom gallery where they blended in with the regular spectators. Bradley Morrison arrived with his usual confidence, briefcase in hand and expensive suit perfectly pressed. He nodded to several of his friends and clients, all of whom were looking forward to watching him destroy another family in court. Judge Whitman entered her chambers early to review her notes one final time. She wanted to make sure she played her part perfectly. The resort company was paying her well, and she intended to earn every dollar. As the courtroom began to fill with spectators, Robert sat alone on his bench, clutching his folder of documents. To everyone watching, he looked like a defeated old man making one last desperate attempt to save his home. His veteran's badge caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and several people pointed at it with the same amused contempt they had shown before. But today, things would be different. Today, the people who had laughed at the veteran's badge were about to learn exactly what it represented, and exactly what kind of family they had chosen to destroy. The countdown had reached 0. And Robert Martinez's son was about to walk into that courtroom with backup that would change everything. The courtroom was packed with the usual crowd of lawyers, wealthy spectators, and courthouse regulars who had come to witness what they expected to be Robert Martinez's final defeat. Judge Whitman took her seat at the bench, her black robes concealing the expensive jewelry she had purchased with her illegal payments. Bradley Morrison arranged his papers with theatrical precision, playing to his audience of admiring friends and clients. Robert sat alone in the front row, his weathered hands folded over the same thin folder of documents that had failed to save him 3 days earlier. The veteran's badge on his jacket seemed smaller and more tarnished than ever under the harsh courtroom lights. Around him, the whispered jokes and barely concealed laughter continued. "There's the old soldier again," someone muttered, "still thinking that little badge means something. Probably going to tell us more war stories," another voice added with amusement. Judge Whitman banged her gavel to bring the court to order. "We have several property disputes to resolve today. Let's begin with the Martinez case. Mr. Martinez, I believe you requested this additional hearing." Robert stood slowly, his war injury making the movement deliberate and careful. "Yes, Your Honor. I have new evidence that I believe will change your previous ruling." Morrison chuckled and shook his head. "Your Honor, Mr. Martinez has already had his day in court. This appears to be nothing more than a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. My clients have been more than patient." Judge Whitman nodded in agreement. "Mr. Martinez, I hope you understand that this court's time is valuable. If you don't have substantial new evidence, I'll hold you in contempt." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the heavy courtroom door swung open with a force that made everyone turn. The sudden silence was so complete that the mechanical hum of the air conditioning system seemed loud. Marcus Martinez entered the courtroom like a force of nature. He wore his military dress uniform with full decorations, but it was clear this wasn't ceremonial dress. This was the uniform of someone who had earned every ribbon, every medal, every insignia through blood and sacrifice. Behind him, 6 other figures in military dress uniforms followed in perfect formation. The effect on the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. The jokes and laughter died as if someone had flipped a switch. The wealthy spectators who had been so amused by Robert's veteran's badge suddenly found themselves staring at a group of warriors who radiated competence and barely contained power. Marcus's uniform told a story that anyone with military knowledge could read. Special Forces tabs, Ranger qualification badges, multiple combat tours, commendations for valor under fire. But it was the insignia of his current unit that would have made military personnel stand at attention. This was someone who operated at the highest levels of national security. Captain Chen entered next, her uniform equally impressive. Then came Reaper, whose massive frame and collection of military decorations suggested someone who had seen combat in every major conflict of the past decade. The other team members followed, each one representing the absolute pinnacle of military training and experience. Bradley Morrison's confident smile faltered as he tried to process what he was seeing. Judge Whitman's eyes widened with something that might have been recognition or fear. The wealthy spectators who had been so entertained by mocking Robert's service suddenly found themselves face to face with active-duty warriors who made their expensive suits and country club membership seem meaningless. Marcus walked directly to his father and embraced him, then turned to face the court. "Your Honor, I am Master Sergeant Marcus Martinez, United States Army Special Operations Command. I'm here to present evidence in my father's case." Judge Whitman's voice carried a slight tremor. "Sergeant Martinez, this is highly irregular. Military personnel don't typically appear in civilian court proceedings. You're absolutely right, Your Honor, Marcus replied with military precision. We don't typically get involved in civilian matters. But when those civilian matters involve federal crimes, things change quickly. Morrison jumped to his feet. Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding. Whatever Mr. Martinez thinks he's doing, it has no bearing on a simple property dispute. Captain Chen stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mr. Morrison, I'm Captain Sarah Chen, Federal Task Force 7. This stopped being a simple property dispute the moment you began forging documents and bribing federal judges. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Morrison's face went pale and Judge Whitman gripped her gavel with white knuckles. Several of the wealthy spectators began looking toward the exits, but they quickly noticed that men in dark suits had quietly positioned themselves near every door. Furthermore, Captain Chen continued, this court is now under federal jurisdiction. Judge Whitman, you are hereby relieved of authority in this matter. Judge Whitman found her voice, though it shook with indignation and fear. You have no authority here. This is my courtroom. Reaper stepped forward, his presence filling the space with quiet menace. Ma'am, with respect, you lost any authority you might have had when you took your first bribe payment. We have recordings of every conversation, copies of every financial transaction, and evidence of every illegal ruling you've made. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again. Federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI began filing in, followed by representatives from the Department of Justice. The transformation of the courtroom from a local legal proceeding to a federal crime scene was swift and absolute. The agent in charge, Special Agent Rodriguez, approached the bench. Judge Patricia Whitman, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, racketeering, and corruption of federal judicial proceedings. Morrison tried to back toward a side exit, but found his path blocked by two agents. Bradley Morrison, Agent Rodriguez continued, you are under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, fraud, and racketeering. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the two people who had controlled Robert's fate just days earlier were led away in custody. The wealthy spectators who had found Robert's veteran's badge so amusing were now desperately trying to distance themselves from the arrested officials, claiming they had no knowledge of any criminal activity. Marcus approached the bench where his father was still sitting in stunned silence. Dad, it's over. The property is yours, the charges against you are dropped, and everyone who tried to steal from you is going to prison. Robert looked up at his son with tears in his eyes. How did you do all this? Captain Chen answered for Marcus. Mr. Martinez, your son is part of an elite unit that investigates corruption and organized crime when it threatens national security. The people who were trying to steal your land were laundering money for terrorist organizations. Your case gave us the opportunity to bring down the entire network. As federal agents continued to make arrests throughout the courtroom, Robert stood and embraced his son again. The veteran's badge on his jacket caught the light, but now it seemed brighter somehow, more substantial. The people who had mocked it were either in handcuffs or desperately trying to explain their innocence to federal investigators. Dad, Marcus said quietly, I'm sorry it took me so long to get here, but when someone threatens our family, when they disrespect what that badge represents, they have no idea what they're bringing down on themselves. The old veteran looked around the courtroom that had been transformed from a place of injustice into a scene of federal law enforcement. His family's land was safe, his legacy was secure, and the criminals who had tried to destroy him were facing decades in prison. The people had laughed at the veteran's badge. Now they understood exactly what it meant when a warrior's family was threatened, and exactly what kind of backup one phone call could bring. Within hours of receiving the Marine's call, the Foundation had connected him with federal investigators, provided legal representation, and alerted Marcus's contacts in law enforcement. The criminals were arrested before they could complete their fraud, and the Marine kept his property. Similar successes followed across the country. The Foundation's network of military contacts, legal experts, and federal law enforcement created a rapid response system that could address veteran-targeted crimes quickly and effectively. What had taken months to resolve in Robert's case could now be handled in days or weeks. The Foundation also worked to educate veterans about their rights and how to recognize common fraud schemes. Robert found himself speaking at military bases, veterans organizations, and community events, sharing his story and teaching others how to protect themselves. During one such presentation at a military base in North Carolina, a young sergeant approached Robert after his speech. "Sir, my grandfather served in Vietnam too. He always said that veterans take care of each other, but I never really understood what that meant until I heard your story." Robert shook the young man's hand. "Son, that badge you'll earn when you complete your service isn't just a decoration. It's a promise that you're never alone, that your brothers and sisters in arms will always have your back. Remember that and make sure the veterans who come after you remember it too." As Robert drove home from that event, he thought about how much his life had changed. A year ago, he had been a lonely widower facing the loss of everything he held dear. Now, he was part of a national movement to protect veterans' rights and combat corruption. The veteran's badge on his jacket meant more now than it ever had before. It had become a symbol not just of his own service, but of the entire community of warriors who refused to let injustice prevail. The people who had once laughed at that badge had learned a lesson that was being repeated across the country. When you threaten one veteran, you threaten them all. 1 year after the dramatic courtroom confrontation that changed everything, Robert Martinez stood before a gathering of over 500 veterans and their families at the annual Veterans Justice Foundation conference. The foundation that had grown from his personal struggle now operated in all 50 states, with regional offices, full-time staff, and a network of volunteer attorneys who specialized in helping veterans fight fraud and corruption. The conference was being held at a resort hotel just 20 miles from Robert's property, but this was a legitimate business built with honest money and employing local workers at fair wages. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that they were celebrating justice in the same region where criminals had once planned to build their money laundering operation. Marcus had returned from his latest deployment just in time for the conference. His special operations unit had been called to investigate a similar corruption network in Eastern Europe, where organized crime groups were targeting American military families stationed overseas. The mission had been successful, resulting in dozens of arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen funds. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began his keynote address, "a year ago I thought I was fighting alone to save my family's land. I had no idea that my struggle was part of something much larger, or that one phone call to my son would spark a movement that would help thousands of our brothers and sisters in uniform." The audience included veterans from every conflict since World War II, along with active duty service members, military families, and civilian supporters. Also present were federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and other law enforcement officials who had worked on cases spawned by the original investigation. "I want to tell you about some of the victories we've achieved together this year," Robert continued. "We've helped recover over $50 million in stolen property and fraudulent charges targeting veterans. We've assisted in the prosecution of more than 200 criminals who specifically targeted military families. And we've created a network that ensures no veteran will ever have to fight corruption alone again." The applause was thunderous, but Robert raised his hand for quiet. "But I also want to remind you why this work matters. It's not about the money or the property or even the justice, though all of those things are important. It's about the promise we made to each other when we put on the uniform. It's about the bond that connects every person who ever served this country." Robert touched the veteran's badge on his jacket, the same small piece of metal that had been mocked and dismissed just 1 year earlier. "This badge represents more than just individual service. It represents our commitment to stand together, to protect each other, and to ensure that the values we fought for overseas are honored here at home." In the audience, former Judge Patricia Whitman's replacement, Judge Maria Santos, nodded in agreement. Judge Santos had been appointed after a rigorous vetting process that included input from the Veterans Justice Foundation. She had already handled several cases involving veteran rights, and her courtroom had become known as a place where service members could expect fair treatment and respect. Also present was the new district attorney, James Mitchell, a former military prosecutor who had made veterans' issues a priority for his office. The corrupt officials who had once controlled the local legal system had been replaced by people committed to justice and integrity. The conference included workshops on recognizing fraud schemes, understanding legal rights, and accessing resources for veterans facing legal challenges. Military lawyers provided free consultations, while federal agents explained how to report suspected crimes targeting the military community. During a break in the proceedings, Marcus found his father standing alone on the hotel's terrace, looking out toward the lake where their family property was located. Even from this distance, they could see the small cabin where 3 generations of Martinez men had lived, and where Robert planned to spend his remaining years. "Any regrets, Dad?" Marcus asked. Robert smiled. "About fighting back? Never. About how public it all became? Sometimes. I never wanted to be a spokesman or a leader. I just wanted to keep my land. But look what came from your fight. Look at all the people who've been helped, all the criminals who've been stopped, all the families who get to keep their homes because you refuse to give up." Robert nodded. "Your mother would have been proud. She always said that good things come from standing up for what's right even when it's hard. She would have been proud of both of us, and she would have loved seeing her grandson follow in the family tradition of service." Marcus had news he had been waiting to share. His commanding officer had approved his request to take a permanent position with the Veterans Justice Foundation. His years of experience with special operations and federal law enforcement made him the perfect candidate to head the Foundation's investigative division. "I'm coming home, Dad. Permanently this time. The Foundation needs someone who understands both military culture and federal investigations. And I need to be closer to family." Robert felt tears in his eyes. "What about your unit? Your mission?" "My mission is evolving. For the past 8 years, I've been fighting enemies overseas. Now I want to fight enemies here at home, the ones who target our own people. It's still service, Dad. It's still protecting America." As the conference concluded, participants began making plans for the coming year. Regional coordinators would return to their states to expand local operations. Legal teams would continue pursuing cases against criminal networks targeting veterans. Federal agents would maintain their cooperation with the Foundation's investigations. Final event of the conference was a ceremony honoring the law enforcement officials who had made the original investigation possible. Captain Chen, now promoted to major, received the Foundation's highest award for her leadership in bringing the criminals to justice. Agent Rodriguez was recognized for his coordination between federal and local agencies, but the moment that brought everyone to their feet came when Robert was presented with a special commendation from the Department of Defense, recognizing his contribution to protecting military families from organized crime. The presentation was made by General Patricia Wilson, who had flown in specifically for the ceremony. "Mr. Martinez," General Wilson said, "your courage in standing up to corruption has protected thousands of military families. Your example has shown that the warrior spirit doesn't end when we retire from active duty. You have honored the uniform and the flag in the highest tradition of American service." As Robert accepted the commendation, he thought about all the people who had dismissed him as a broken-down old man clinging to past glory. He thought about the laughter and mockery his veteran's badge had provoked in that courtroom just 1 year ago. Now that same badge was being honored by generals and federal officials. More importantly, it had become a symbol of hope for veterans across the country who faced their own battles against injustice and corruption. The conference ended with a promise to reconvene the following year, but the work would continue every day in between. Phone calls would be answered, cases would be investigated, criminals would be prosecuted, and veterans would be protected. As the crowd began to disperse, Robert Martinez walked slowly toward the hotel exit, his son beside him and his veteran's badge catching the afternoon sunlight. Behind them, hundreds of veterans and their supporters carried with them a renewed sense of purpose and community. The people who had laughed at the veteran's badge had learned that it represented something far more powerful than they could have imagined. It represented a brotherhood that spans generations, a commitment that transcends individual interest, and a promise that no warrior would ever stand alone against injustice. They had laughed at the veteran's badge, but they would never make that mistake again, and neither would anyone else who heard this story.